Iain Ballamy, welcome to Beyond Stage Fright. You're a saxophonist and composer recognised internationally as an original, free-thinking and uncompromising musician whose work is eclectic, contemporary and unencumbered by formality and tradition. You were a founding member of Loose Tubes in 1984, and you've worked with many of the cutting-edge figures of today's contemporary jazz scene over a career spanning more than 30 years. You record for the ECM label with June Tabor and Hugh Warren as the group called Quercus, and with Thomas Stronan as Food. And your latest Food album was listed second out of the Observer's top 10 jazz albums of 2015. You're visiting professor at the Royal Academy of Music, Guildhall School of Music and Drama, Leeds College of Music and the Royal Welsh College of Music and Drama. How much of the work that you do is based on improvisation and how much is written down?
Because of the nature of the spread of different types of music that I play myself, it's not really easy to say this much or that much of it is improvised, because it could vary between very little improvisation to complete improvisation. As a rough guess, generally I'd say maybe 30 to 40% of it's composed, generally speaking. What I can tell you that at both extreme ends of the spectrum, when things are totally improvised, it's more stressful than when things are partially improvised, and when they're totally composed, it's more stressful than when they're partially composed. I guess that's the infrared and ultraviolet end of the spectrum, perhaps you could say.
Can you elaborate and tell me more about that?
Well, I think the thing is the more artistic freedom I'm given with written music, or obviously when you're improvising, it's totally down to you what you decide to play or not to play. I think there's less chance of it actually being a mistake or it being wrong. It's just a question of good or bad choices with what you make, or tasteful or less than tasteful choices. So I think it really comes down to the fact that human beings aren't perfect, and the more perfect we're aspiring to be, or the more perfect we try to play something, then we're always going to be disappointed. And I've met many musicians who I love the way they play, but the ones I try to avoid playing with are the ones who have the self-flagellating post-mortem at the end of a performance. There is a best endeavours thing, and nothing is ever as good as we're going to want it to be, unless you're looking at the overall picture, like the entire performance of the entire band or an entire take of a piece that you've recorded. And then rather than being focused on your own contribution, sometimes you have to say, on balance, that was a really good take. I wish I hadn't played that note slightly late then, or made that mistake there. But it's not really what it's all about if you're being more magnanimous about music making and less egotistical. It's not really about mistakes, it's about intent.
Can you tell me a little bit more about the whole process of improvisation?
There's so many different types of improvisation. I think to a lot of non-jazz musicians it's some mysterious kind of black art or magic or something, white magic, call it whatever you like. Interestingly, it's something that the analogy's been made many times. It's something we all have to do all the time in thinking about how we're going to answer questions, even, or having a conversation. One thing I could say for sure is that we don't particularly like repeating ourselves. So, as an exercise with students to get them to think more deeply or more articulately or less repetitively or something, I came up with a thing saying, imagine you've cooked dinner for 3 people and they're all upstairs and it's getting cold on the table. What are you going to do? And then they say, well, I'd call them to come down. I said, well, how would you do that? They said, well, I'd say dinner's ready. And then I said, okay, so you said dinner's ready and they didn't come down. What do you do then? They say, dinner's ready, slightly different intonation. And then nothing happens and they don't do it again. And they say, it's getting cold, it's on the table, and just to get them to elaborate. And then eventually it's like your dinner's in the dog and the dog's in the oven and I'm leaving, or something like that might be the final thing. But just to give you an example, improvisation is a big subject, but yes, it's not an alien thing. It's something that we do have to do all the time, and getting out of trouble and getting out of situations and thinking on our feet. It's just different when it's a musical version of that. And also, a lot of improvisation isn't as improvised as you might think. It's quite formulaic, and it's quite based on playing the right thing at the right time, using the right scales. And by right I mean in inverted commas. I kind of liked it when the Impressionists decided to paint the sky brown and the grass blue and things like that, because we all know where the sky is and we all know where the grass is. So do we have to paint it the right colour as well, or can we use our imaginations?
And what's it like improvising on demand? Is there any particular stress in that?
Well, you need to know what you're actually improvising with or over. It's not just a case of uninhibitedly playing anything over anything. It's not. I mean, yes, you do have the choice to play whatever you want, but musically speaking, like I said, there's good and bad choices. There's tasteful and tasteless choices, and there's consonant and dissonant choices. Being asked to improvise on demand, I'm very happy to do that. I don't feel uncomfortable with it. I prefer, in some ways, if it's a piece of written music, to hear it first, and normally you would. But I mean, we live a bit by our wits, I think. You learn to listen. I mean, a lot of improvising it's about listening. It's not just about having something you want to say or want to play and getting that out. It's about listening and mixing with what you hear around you and making things that complement the music that you're already enhancing or playing with.
And do you have performance anxiety? And if you do, how does it manifest?
In the last year and a half or so, I've done 3 saxophone concerto performances with BBC Phil, BBC Concert Orchestra, and Strasbourg Philharmonic, which, coming from my where I've come at the music from, I'm not a conservatoire trained, SAS crack squad classical soloist. And what I found very challenging about being given this thing, I mean, all of these concertos did have elements of improvisation, but also, largely speaking, they were very through composed and quite virtuosic in places. One was a Richard Rodney Bennett concerto, another one was by Gary Carpenter. And the hardest thing I found was the differential between the build-up to the performance, starting with the day you got the music and the practicing every day and the perfecting, and this huge build-up to 20 minutes to get it right or wrong. It's sort of sink or swim, and then it's over, and the thing that you've been had at the centre of your attention and at your musical life in your practice, it's gone, it's just finished. And I found that to be the hardest thing, doing a big piece like that. That's where the real fear is, I think. Live on the radio, one chance with an orchestra, a lot at stake. It's the sort of thing musicians have nightmares about, something going wrong in those situations of one kind or another. And I guess the more experience you get anticipating how you're going to feel in the build-up, the performance and the aftermath, or the drinks reception afterwards, or whatever it's going to be, I think I'm getting more acclimatised to that, but it's certainly been, I found it very stressful. And to deal with that feeling, there's like a voice in your head saying, now come on, you're good enough to be doing this because you've been chosen to do it and you've been practicing for 6 months. And another part of you saying, well, supposing something goes wrong. And then another part of you saying, if you think about something going wrong, it almost inevitably will, and then it does. And it's just a question of reasoning with yourself and saying, why have I spent my whole life working towards this moment, doing something I love doing, to then go and spoil it by having unhelpful interference in your head? So part of it's irrational, and then you try to rationalise it and put those things aside. It can never go as well as you want to if you're looking for perfection, but if you take a step back and look at it, like I said, as an overall thing. I've got a very good musician friend called John Paracelli. I don't know if you know him. He's a wonderful guitarist and session player and jazz musician. He's absolutely fantastic. And whenever I play with John, and whenever I play anyway, his words rattle in my head, which is, he always says this thing after we've been playing, he says, was that all right? Did we do all right? Yeah, we did all right. Yeah, we did all right. That was all right. That was all right. And then we have a kind of a little pat on the back and away we go, And it's the opposite to the, oh, I'm sorry about that. Oh, I really messed that bit up or whatever. We just got to, I think if you get too perfectionist about it, you'd never be able to play it. Speaking for myself, I'd never be able to play at all. And I don't particularly enjoy sitting back and listening to things I've done. I find it quite excruciating in a way. But in order to carry on doing this, it's a performing art, and you just have to. It's like a hump you have to get over and move on and accept. I mean, maybe there's a bit of egotism. You need to have an ego to play music, but if you haven't got that, then why would people want to hear you play music in the first place even? But I don't know, it's a funny balance between having enough ego to do it and not too much to beat yourself up about it or to be very difficult.
And what's the difference between doing those concertos, which was high pressure and a feeling of sort of having to get it right and in that moment, and doing more of the improvised work you do aside from that? How do the two things compare?
I suppose there is an overall agenda when you're improvising, which is to make good music. There's an overall agenda when you're playing complicated written music or very exposed written music to play it perfectly or as well as you can. So in a way that they do have the same thing in common. I just think probably for jazz musicians, the more freedom they're given, the more comfortable I think in my case anyway, the more comfortable I feel, the more hemmed in I am, the more the onus is on playing the music correctly, and therefore the opportunity to be, troubled or rattled or disappointed or stressed or nervous about it increases. Perhaps, if you know the music really, really well, to be playing a concerto with no music because you know it well enough to be able to do that, then it's just a question of not having any psychological interference, like worrying about getting lost or something like that. But having learned these two concertos, I think I could just pick up my saxophone now and pretty much play them from memory anyway. So it's just different when you come to do it with a conductor and an orchestra in this situation.
And have you ever had any performing disasters, or what you might consider to be performing disasters, even though the audience might not notice?
Well, yeah, I think we've all got one of those. I remember playing in a festival in Germany, and for some reason I was on with Bill Bruford's group, with Django Bates and Bill Bruford, and their band was called Earthworks, and we were on after Jan Garbarek, who you probably know from the wonderful stuff with the Hilliard Ensemble. And we did the sound check and everything was fine, and I came on and it was just something was wrong with the saxophone, but it wasn't wrong that it wouldn't actually work. It was odd. It was like a bit like our Skype connection earlier on when we were trying to make this interview work. It just sounded a bit muffled and not really quite thing. And we got all the way through the entire concert. I just soldiered on and thought, well, I'll put that behind me, And then we came to take the bow at the front of the stage at the end of the performance, and as I bent down with my saxophone, a full box of reeds dropped out of the bell. And I thought, no. And we did an encore, and it was like everything was fine then, But it was just the most stupid thing,
So how do you prepare for a performance in the weeks beforehand, but also on the day?
Well, a jazz performance, I think most musicians, they've got their practice routine that they do. We'd rehearse with the band anyway, and maybe on the day get there early and run stuff through, get a good sound up and practice some stuff. I might practice the heads or the tunes at home, maybe go through some of the blowing or the improvising. But generally speaking, your residual level of being able to play has to be kept up, especially with brass instruments, with anything really. You're on saxophone, we've got the problem with the reeds and stuff, so making sure you've got something that enables you to play up and down the instrument at all dynamics with good dexterity and stuff like that. So I prepare like that. I know how to make sure my instrument's working properly because I actually learned to do that for a couple of years. Really, it's just putting all the rubbish out of your head and getting on with making music.
How do you find the recording studio for stress and anxiety?
I find it very difficult, actually. The last handful of records over pretty much have been live recordings that I've done with June Tabor and Hugh Warren. We did a live recording which just was never intended to be a record, but it was just one of those lucky strike things when we recorded it and listened back, and it was just nobody coughed in the wrong places, and the piano was beautiful and the balance was great and the performance was good. And I quite like the idea of recording for no particular reason, but you're at liberty to use it if you're happy with it, rather than having the stress of saying, right, we've done this loads of times live, but now we've got to go and make a definitive version in the studio. One of the problems with working in the studio is that it's quite artificial environment in terms of separation and monitoring and using headphones. I mean, generally speaking, on stage you don't have one headphone half on and off one ear, with the drums not in the room but coming out through the headphones, and you needing to hear some of yourself as well. It's difficult to make good studio recording without spill onto other people's microphones sound-wise. And then obviously if you need to make a repair, your choices are very limited by what you can do if a mistake spilled onto something you've already recorded. So I prefer live recording. In the process of actually recording and psychologically, I think the best result I've managed to get, or the way I prefer to work, is to say you've got 10 tunes to record. You'd go in on the first morning, record all 10 tunes, then go out, have some lunch, forget all about it, not do too much listening back, and then do the same thing in the afternoon once or twice, and then maybe have a listen at the end of the day, and then do the same thing the next day if you're lucky enough to have a next day. And then, most importantly of all, to forget about how you felt while you were doing it, when you were in the process and things weren't quite right, or you felt uncomfortable with your sound. Because don't forget, you're recording things flat, and there's no flattering EQ or reverb or anything to make it sound it. It's just a very basic, faithful recording. So when you come back to listen to it a few weeks later or a week later, or certainly once the dust settles and you've forgotten about the trials and tribulations or highs and lows of the recording experience, to then come back and listen afresh, and I find that much better, rather than doing a take and, all right, let's go in and have a listen to that. Oh no, can we do that again? And people invariably focus on their own contribution and get self-absorbed about whether they played a slightly flat note. That for them can make that not a good take, when in actual fact, taking a step back at arm's length, you could say it was a fantastic take. And what difference does it make if there's this one note that's out of tune that can maybe be improved a little bit anyway? Nowadays you can mend and repair and fix and make good things in a way you never could before when tape was analog.
And what about the rest of the group when you're in that situation? How do you manage, you might feel nervous yourself and some of the others might be feeling nervous as well. How do you manage that between you?
Well, as a band leader, which I generally am, I think people have different ways of getting good results out of the people they play with. My personal choice is to choose musicians to play with who I like, who I can get on with, who I actually like spending the time with as well, not just musically. In other words, people that you feel at ease with, if that makes sense. And the skill, I think, is to book musicians to to do their thing rather than to book a musician and tell them how you want them to play. Because, I mean, generally speaking, I think when people ask me to come, they ask me to come because they want me to do what I can do on the saxophone, not just because they need a saxophone player who can maybe do this, that and the other. That I play the way I can play, and I think if I'm asked to play, I'm asked to come and be me. And so therefore, like when I book musicians, I book them for who they are to do what they can do. And I think if you're really clever about that, you get people end up thinking you're more of a genius than you actually are, because the real skill is to book the right musicians to make more than the sum of the parts. And I mean, you can explain the way you want the music to be or the aesthetic of the music, but telling someone how to play is never the way to go, I don't think.
Does it reduce anxiety levels to have that good bunch of people that you feel really comfortable working with, who are doing really well at what they do?
It does, and I think it's for them as well. I think if you're easygoing about it, I mean, obviously we're all professional and we're serious about what we do, but I don't think there's any point in making people feel uncomfortable or putting pressure on them. I think you get people the best results and the best will, to get people on your side and working towards the same thing. You need to give them a sense of ownership of the music. If it's my band and I wrote the music and I'm telling people how to play and it's all about me, then I wouldn't particularly enjoy that. I've been in those situations over the years as well. What I most like of all is to feel a part of something, that I can bring something to the table, not just show up and perform a task that the composer or the band leader has asked me to do. I mean, they could get anybody if they want to do that, but if they've asked me, I'd like to be able to come along and bring what I can to the music. I realise it's a rare and exalted and fortunate position to be in, but making music like that. But I guess that's the result of having made a lot of choices over a lot of years to end up being in a position where I'm playing the music I want to play with the people I want to play it with, rather than being booked to play music by people who want me to play a certain way on this instrument or that instrument, which I don't really want to be playing, but it's part of being a useful musician and therefore what you have to do.
How much do you feel in jazz that a musician brings their personality into the music?
Anything between 0 and 100%. I mean, some musicians they're basically at one end of the spectrum trying to emulate and copy and impersonate and worship and pay tribute to people who are their idols. And then everything across the spectrum, including some of that, but not entirely, right through to people who are entirely uncompromising and all they do is their own thing and they don't listen to anyone else or sound like anyone else. And you could say that was a more of an extreme version. Musicians who are well versed and well trained in the legacy and the lineage of the music or any kind of music, they're trained and experienced and well listened and well read and experienced. But at some point, I've always thought it was important to bring your own thing to the table, as it were, based on everything that switched you on and inspired you in the first place. So it doesn't come from nowhere, but at the same time, it's not just trying to emulate the music that's been in the past. Really, the challenge for a musician or a composer, I think, is to remain inspired. And if you find that banjo music inspires you, you're a lucky musician. The more you listen to one kind of music, the less you're likely to be excited and invigorated and get the goose pimples on your arms from it. Being open and trying to find music that gives you that joie de vivre and that inspiration, that feeling. It doesn't matter where it comes from. It's that the thing that makes you feel alive as a human being and as a musician is all I care about. And if that happens to be deeply uncool, so be it.
And what does it feel like when you're on stage and you're giving a performance and everything is just really flowing and really working, and people are sort of really connecting. What does it feel like when it's just really going well?
I think a few years ago, in one of those momentary flashes, I suddenly realised why we do this, and I think it's for those moments. I think it's for those moments when you're there but you're not there, which sounds bizarre, but you're free from the interference of all the kind of things that been talking to me about today. You're free from panic and fear and self-consciousness and uncomfortableness, and it's a very nice state, really. It's a bit like being, I guess maybe like meditation, i.e. you're not asleep but you're not in a normal state, and it's a very cerebral state to be in, and I think it's one of the things. It doesn't happen all the time. It doesn't happen for prolonged periods of time, but it's almost like the reward for all the hard work and the great feeling. And importantly, it's not just a great feeling for me. It's a great feeling for me to be having with the other people that I'm making the music with, in the situation with the audience. This is an important point, actually. It's not just about how it's going for me. It's about the experience, just the occasion or the situation when the music's going well, the making of and the receiving of and the giving of and the creating of and the actual thing. When that's going well, that's just brilliant. It's great. It's why we do it, I think.
Iain Ballamy, thank you very much. I've really enjoyed talking with you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you.